In many cases in the modern world, oaths and contracts are sealed with the shake of a hand, normally right hands. It is, in these situations, another form of oath taken with the outstretched right arm, and, as in the previous cases, handshaking with the right hand is based upon an ancient archetype. But we first start with the history of the practice. The shaking of the right hands is a common motif in the Greek art of antiquity. It is called dexiosis, meaning to offer or join right hands. The motif is an ancient one, dating back to the archaic period of Greece. We know that dexiosis was originally of divine origin, practiced among the gods from the numerous reliefs which show one god shaking the hand of another god, as in this relief of Athena shaking Hera's hand, or a mortal shaking the hand of a demigod, as in this relief with Antiochus, king of Commagene, and the Greek demigod Heracles. Extending the right hand to another was an important part of the cultural landscape of ancient Israel. It was used as a token of submission when Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon conquered Israel during the time of Jeremiah. To give one's hand means to stretch forth the right hand in submission. The giving of the right hand was also symbolic of fealty to one's own liege lord. This was the case at the accession to the throne by Solomon, where the officers and sons of King David pledged their loyalty. The pledge, according to the original Hebrew, was made by giving the right hand. The extending of the hand as submission or loyalty was not a one-sided gesture. The one receiving the token had to accept and thereby respond in kind. The two-way gesture was a clasping of the hands. This is made explicit in the story of Jehu and Jehonadab. It appears to the modern reader that the offering of hands was simply to enable Jehonadab to easily get into the chariot. But this is not the case within the ancient context. The clasping of hands was a token of loyalty, which was the express purpose of giving the hand. The giving and clasping of right hands was a token or oath of pledge. In the time of Ezra the priest, when the Jews were allowed to rebuild the temple, those that returned with Ezra made a solemn covenant with their right hands to put away their non-covenant wives. Zedekiah broke his alliance with the king of Babylon, which he had entered into with an oath sealed by giving his right hand. Proverbs indicates that the Israelites exchanged pledges by shaking hands with foreigners, meaning the practice was not limited to Israel. Indeed, the practice was known throughout classical antiquity. When Glaucus met Diomedes on the battlefield in face-to-face combat during the Trojan War, they first talked. After their talk, the two decided to form a friendly alliance. They did so by exchanging armor and shaking hands. The shaking hands was also a token of an oath of peace in ancient Rome as well. When the second triumvirate was formed between Caesar Augustus, Mark Antony, and Marcus Lepidus, they joined hands. Clasping of hands, as in the modern practice, was a ritual greeting and confirmation of friendship. In Virgil's Aeneid, King Aeneas and Anchises clasp hands when reuniting with each other. Anchises also shook the right hand of Ecumenides as a sign of ready trust. King Hezekiah sent letters throughout Israel and Judah, as well as Ephraim and Manasseh, to come to the Temple of Jerusalem to observe the Passover. In the proclamation of invitation, the king exhorted the Israelites to turn back to the Lord. In part, the decree stated the following. The Hebrew interpreted as yield, literally translated, is give your hand to Jehovah. A covenant to the Lord was symbolically enacted by shaking his hand. In the time of the Apostle Paul, clasping right hands amongst the members of the church was called the right hands of fellowship. Peter, James, and John extended the right hand to fellowship to Paul and Barnabas. This particular right hand of fellowship was a form of covenant where Paul and Barnabas were accepted as fellow missionaries. The shaking of right hands in fellowship continues to this day. In many Christian denominations, the ritual signifies formal acceptance into the congregation. Though Latter-day Saints do not have a formal or ritualized right hand of fellowship, they are acclaimed handshakers. Leaders counsel members to shake the hands of visitors and the less active. The extended right hand is also used in missionary tool, as in this Mormon ad.
In 1843, Joseph Smith openly revealed what he called the 3 grand keys by which ministering angels could be distinguished. There are 2 types of true messengers from God: resurrected beings with a physical body and spirit beings without a physical body. The devil, who does not have a physical body, sometimes appears pretending to be a messenger of light. This makes it necessary to devise a means to discern between true and false messengers. The keys require the shaking of hands. The mortal receiving the messenger requests the messenger to shake his hand. Though it is not made express, the offered hand is the right hand, the universally acknowledged hand for giving an oath. When the messenger extends his right hand in covenant, he is confirming his true divine commission. A true angel will honor the request and shake hands. His hand will be felt, since he has a resurrected physical body. Since a just man made perfect is a spirit being, and his hand cannot be felt by a mortal, he will refuse the request to shake hands, for that would be a form of deceit. He will instead simply deliver his message. Unlike true messengers, the devil is a deceiver. He can appear as an angel of light, but being a spirit being, his hand cannot be felt. Yet he will still accept the request and shake hands, hoping to deceive the mortal in question. Joseph Smith called these tokens grand keys to know whether an administration is from God. These keys likely belong to the keys of the ministering of angels, where angels receive their authority to minister and their laws and limitations by which they minister. Even wicked spirits have limitations and are bound by laws. The devil is bound by laws for the ministering of angels and its 3 grand keys of detection, as Joseph Smith explained. All keys, including the 3 grand keys, are symbolically patterned after the heavenly archetypes. These keys are patterned after the Sacred Handclasp. The Roman version of dexiosis, the extending and clasping of the right hand, is iantio dextrarum. As in ancient Greece, the joining of right hands was an important religious and social ritual, signifying friendship, loyalty, and accord. Tacitus, in his First History, reported that the Celtic Langines gave presents to the Roman legions following the established custom of clasped right hand. The handshake was consecrated to the god of fidelity and, as such, represented a covenant of fidelity. More importantly, the clasping of hands was used to solemnize marriages in the Roman Empire. This custom was present throughout the empire for centuries, from the end of the Republican Age to Christian Rome. The ritual of clasping right hands in marriage as a token of fidelity continues to modern times. The iconic gesture is used in representations of the marriage of the Virgin Mary. In these representations, the hands are not joined or clasped. Instead, the right hands are extended, with Joseph putting a ring on Mary's right ring finger. Clasped or not, the image and idea is the same, a covenant of fidelity. A similar marriage rite is hand fasting, where the hands of the married couple are tied together with a ribbon or cloth. This is the origin of priests wrapping their stoles around the clasped hands of the husband and wife, solemnizing the marriage. The joining of right hands during marriage rites predate the Greeks and Romans. Mosaics in a basilica in Rome depict biblical marriages consummated by iantio dextrarum. The best preserved mosaic portrays the marriage of Moses and Zipporah. Moses and Zipporah clasp hands in front of Jethro, the high priest of Midian, who officiates over the ceremony. The arrangement of the scene follows the iconography of Roman marriage ceremonies, with Juno pro nuba standing in between husband and wife. The second mosaic is the marriage of Rachel and Jacob. The iconographic arrangement is the same, with Jacob and Rachel clasping right hands and Laban standing in the middle like Jethro of the previous mosaic. A similar marriage setting is found in early Christianity. On this sarcophagus of the patron saint of Tolentino, a detail depicts the saint next to his wife. Husband and wife are clasping right hands. Above and between the couple is a crown. The crown is held by the hand of God. Above and to the right and left of the crown are the Greek letters chi and rho, signifying Christ. The hand-held crown between the couple places Christ in the same position of Juno pro nuba and Concordia. Christ, like the two pagan goddesses, and like Jethro and Laban, seals the marriage with the crown. With the hand of God at the bottom, the crown takes the form of an ancient Egyptian shenbond. The shenbond was associated with the falcon, a form of the Egyptian male warrior hero, Horus. That is, Horus and the falcon were avatars of the planet Mars. The falcon held the shenbond in its claws, just as Christ held the crown in his hand. The shenbond later became the cartouche, a stylized loop enclosing the names of royalty. The cartouche on a temple pillar encloses the name of the Roman emperor, Tiberius. The shen bond and crown, combined with the clasp of right hands, will become important when we explore sealings of man and wife under the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. When a couple is united as man and wife in the temple and under the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, they do so with the iunctio dextrarum. They clasp right hands over the altar. The officiator, called the sealer, sits at the head of the altar, in between the man and the woman, and figuratively above them. This is the position of Juno Pronuba, Concordia, Jethro, Laban, and Christ, whom the sealer represents. The sealer directs the couple to take each other's right hands over the altar. Children are similarly sealed to parents, placing their right hands on their parents' clasped hands, forming a joint handshake. Previous to the rites of sealing, the bride and groom had made a covenant of fidelity that would form the basis of the new marriage. This was done by raising the right arm to the square. During the endowment proper, the bride and groom and other couples are taught the true order of prayer. They do so with the robes of the priesthood on their right shoulders. The couples form a circle around the altar, the sacred enclosure. Once the circle has been formed, brothers first join right hands with the sisters at their left. The context of the handshake in LDS sealings is eternal marriage. Marriage lasts beyond the grave. This can be interpreted to be the case when the handclasp is used for marriage partners in reliefs on sarcophagi. Though often believed to be a token of farewell, there is the sense that the unbroken clasp of the hand signified union beyond the grave. Death does not break the bond. The religions of the Greeks and Romans certainly recognized eternal marriage as it is typified in their myths. The myth of Selene and Endymion symbolized marriage beyond the grave. The goddess Selene fell in love with the mortal Endymion due to his surpassing beauty. So that she could be with him forever, she asked Zeus to give Endymion eternal sleep. In a funerary inscription on the 2nd to 4th century AD, a young wife comforts her husband with the prospect of reuniting in the afterlife. Clasped hands were often engraved on 19th century American tombstones. In many cases, the meaning of farewell is made explicit. But the handshake between husband and wife also meant that marriage endured after death. With the figure of a god or one acting in behalf of God, such as a priesthood officiator, positioned between the husband and wife as they clasp hands, the archetype also represents the triangular nature of the marital relationship. It is not just man and wife, it is man and wife and God who presides over the relationship. This has been a central teaching of marriage under the new and everlasting covenant. Before we continue further concerning the arm and hand of God, we must first codify what we have covered so far. We will use the three-tiered structure of archetypes within the prophetic tradition. We begin with the extended arm and hand of God. The same archetype gave rise to the salute. The extended arm and hand was alternatively interpreted as the raised arm and hand of God. In this case, the interpretations were also different. When interpreted by itself, the hand of God generated numerous other archetypes. The Sacred Handclasp is an entirely different archetype based upon entirely different physical realities. For now, we will summarize the meanings of the archetype we have explored to date without reference to the physical basis. The Sacred Handclasp, or handshake, is a complex set of archetypes. It has multiple elements derived from multiple planetary relationships and phenomena. These elements and their physical origins can only be discovered by the underlying form. Before we look at the underlying form of the handclasp itself, we need to first identify the participants. That is, who are the mythic participants in the handshake and what is their origin? We will find the answer to these questions in the archetype of the heavenly twins. The ancient heavens were much different than they are today. While the sun was present, the dominant figures were three planets at Earth's northern axis: Mars, Venus, and Saturn, in that order. The sun illuminated Saturn, forming a crescent on the planet. Due to the Earth's rotation, the crescent revolved around the axis. David Talbot explains.
Yes, today's sun was present. It was the sun that cast the illuminated crescent on the towering form of Saturn. Ancient astronomies placed Saturn at a preposterous location, far from the orbit that we know today. Saturn occupied the celestial pole, the axial center of the turning heavens. This unthinkable idea, when taken with the seriousness it deserves, places stringent demands on our reconstruction and an inescapable requirement that the crescent revolve around the polar center in a cycle of day and night, descending to the left at sunset, below at midnight, rising to the right at sunrise, and standing inverted above at noon.
It was this crescent that gave rise to the notion of twins, a notion that was universal throughout the ancient world.
Ancient words and symbols for this cycle invariably reflect the symmetrical opposition of the crescent in its contrasting phases: a phase of growing bright and a phase of growing dim, crescent to the left and crescent to the right, crescent above or below, all in explicit connection to a daily cycle with no counterpart in any celestial behavior observed today. And this unique behavior, by its specificity, gives us an ideal opening to the ancient myth of the heavenly twins.
The two opposite or mirror positions of the crescent, above and below and right and left, define the twins. In between the pair is a central figure, the conjunction of Mars and Venus.
In our reconstruction of the ancient sky, the answer comes from the fundamental role of the rotating crescent, reflected in the strategic placement and unique gestures of the cosmic twins around a central figure. and we see the same geometry in the two faces of the ancient God himself. Two contexts of the mirror images stand out. The first points back to the crescent above and below, and the second to the same crescent in its positions to the left and right in the daily cycle.
Some twins are portrayed facing each other from the right and the left, as in this mosaic of Romulus and Remus. This would be the mirror image of the crescent at sunrise on the right and the sunset on the left. Two arms of the twins are raised and form right angles or crescents. They extend towards the central figure, the wolf. The two lower arms extend to each other, stopping at a central point. The wolf, as central figure, is Mars. The red planet was anciently connected with the animal, as Ev Cochrane points out. Other heavenly pairs face each other from above and below. In this detail from the Book of the Dead, the so-called sky goddess Nut arches over Geb, who lies below. The central figure in this case is Shu, standing with arms upraised, forming two crescents. Like the wolf of Remus in Romulus, Shu is an avatar of the planet Mars. Ev Cochrane again makes this connection. Shu is also closely associated with the world pillar and the crescent in its lower phase. The mythological twins of the ancient nations came in different formulations. Some pairs were two males, as these Hindu gods. Other pairs were male and female, such as the Greek Apollo and Artemis. Female twins were also part of the mythic archetype. Clytemnestra and Helen of Troy were the twin sisters of the twin brothers Castor and Pollux. The twins of ancient mythology were not defined simply by gender. The pairs also combined deities and mortals in various formulations. Some twins were both gods, like Eros and Antheros. Other sets of twins were both mortals, such as Cassandra and her brother Helenus. There were also mixed twins, one a god and another a mortal. Hercules and Iphicles were twin brothers with the same mortal mother, but Hercules was the son of Zeus and therefore divine, while Iphicles was the son of a human father. With the underlying archetype of the two crescents on each side, the twins were often portrayed as facing each other. With the plasma streamers extending from the crescents to the center, the twins extended their arms towards each other. Michelangelo's creation of man follows the same pattern of facing twins. God and Adam face each other with outstretched arms. God is within a circular enclosure. This fits Jeremiah's statement that man was created by God's outstretched hand. A common variation of the mythic twins is the archetype of the rival twins, who fight each other for primacy from the womb. The Pyramids text recount that Nut bore two twin sons, Osiris and Set. Set broke out of the womb so that he could be born first. Eventually, Set killed Osiris. In ancient Persian myth, Ahriman, the evil twin of Ahura Mazda, likewise forced his way out of the womb to be born first. But our purpose is to relate the archetype of the twins to the Sacred Handclasp. We start with two rival twins of the Bible. Tamar was impregnated by her father-in-law Judah, producing twins. When the twins were about to be delivered, one child extended his hand outside the womb. The midwife, believing that this child would be delivered first, tied a red thread around the hand. But the midwife was mistaken. The child withdrew his hand and his brother came out first, following the mythic pattern of one twin forcing his way out of the womb before the other. The mythical elements of the rival twin archetype are presented. The womb is the circular enclosure. The scarlet thread is also representative of the circular enclosure. Its color identifies the child, Zara, as an avatar of the red planet Mars. The twins, as we have established, are the two opposite crescents, right and left. When Zara extends his arm from the womb, the action imitates the plasma streamer extending towards the center of the enclosure. The most famous set of biblical rival twins, of course, is Jacob and Esau. Like many rival twins, their rivalry began in the womb. In this variation, Jacob extended his arm and took hold of Esau's heel. As is the pattern, the womb is the circular enclosure and the twins the opposing crescents. In this case, the plasma streamers represent the arm of Jacob and the leg of Esau. As we argued earlier, the plasma streamers of Venus represented limbs, which could be arms or legs. The joining of hands and heel was a form of the Sacred Handclasp. Some mythical twins are male and female who become husband and wife. Ancient Egypt had several of this type of twins. So did the ancient Greeks. The Chinese also had married twins in their mythic pantheon. In Hindu mythology, Yama and Yami are another such twin couple. One of the elements of the mythic archetype of married twins is that these couples were also the primogenitors of the human race, as Yama and Yami were. Fuzai and Noah were also the first progenitors of the human family. Now this brings us to Adam and Eve, a biblical version of the mythic married twins. We know from the biblical record that Adam and Eve were the first humans created by God and placed on earth. We also know that from these parents sprang all the generations of humans. Eve was the mother of all living. That Adam and Eve were married does not mean that they were brother and sister, let alone twins. Is there evidence in the scriptural record that indicates that Adam and Eve were twin brother and sister? The Jewish rabbis have long considered the first man and woman to be a form of twins. According to the rabbinical commentary known as Midrash, Adam and Eve were originally one androgynous being that had to be split apart to make two beings, male and female. This is a perfect description of the mythic twins who were double-faced, known as Januform, after the Roman two-faced god Janus. In essence, like Janus and other twin husbands and wives who shared the same body, Adam and Eve were a mythical form of Siamese twins. Adam and Eve as a type of Siamese twins is strengthened by the story of Adam's rib. According to the Genesis account, Eve was created from a rib taken from a sleeping Adam. This story is taken directly from the revolving crescent of Saturn, where the mythological archetype of twins originated. A rib is essentially a bone in the shape of a crescent. Two opposite ribs to the right and to the left form the heavenly enclosure and represent the celestial twins. The combination of these two ribs also form a whole rib cage. Hence, the imagery of a hermaphrodite separated to become Siamese twins when the ribs are separated. The planetary imagery of the story looked like this. At midnight, when the sky is dark, but the polar configuration is the brightest, Adam is sleeping. At this point, the crescent rotates to the right. The rib has been taken from Adam's body. The crescent continues its course, circling above Adam's head and then moving downward. As it descends and moves towards the pillar, the crescent is reinserted into the body. Adam is now Eve. The rib bone of Adam becomes the rib bone of Eve. As Adam rightly pointed out, Eve is bone of his bone. Mythologically speaking, our first parents were twins. But does this mean that they are twins or even brother and sister in real life? We know from a spiritual perspective that Adam and Eve, like us all, are brothers and sisters, children of God the Father. But the real question is, were Adam and Eve brother and sister physically? Were they physically fraternal twins? The scriptures are clear that Adam was physically the son of God, a product of procreation. Eve likewise must have been a progeny of God the Father since, as Joseph Smith explained, that is the only way the creation of life can happen. This can only mean that Adam and Eve were brother and sister, receiving their physical bodies from the same Father. Neither the scriptures or the prophets, to our knowledge, address the question of Adam and Eve being twins. Symbolically, they are twins, but this does not always translate into literal reality. The original purpose for delving into the mythic archetype of the twins was to explain the practice of dexiosis, or the sacred handclasp. Adam and Eve provide a good starting point. Adam and Eve are a classic example of the mythic twins. Numerous representations show the couple standing opposite and facing each other as the mythic archetype requires. But there is more to the archetype and the representations. The twins' motif is normally centered on the story of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, where Eve first partakes of the fruit and then offers it to Adam. The story presents a couple with a central figure, the tree with a serpent entwined around the trunk. The tree and the snake are based upon the axis mundi, which became the world tree, and a writhing serpent pole. The axis mundi was part and parcel of the twins' archetype. It formed the bodies of the twins as well as the central tree or serpent. For Eve to partake of the fruit of the tree, she had to extend her hand towards the tree. The biblical terminology for this act would have been to put forth the hand. Adam was forbidden to put forth his hand towards the tree of life, another form of the world tree. For Eve to give the fruit and for Adam to accept it, both of them must have extended their hands to each other, or, in other words, towards the center. While this mosaic representation does not include the fruit itself, many others do. Adam and Eve grasp the fruit, forming a circular enclosure around it. Each hand takes the form of a crescent, a diminutive echo of the crescents that form Adam and Eve themselves. This follows the original pattern, where the crescent rotates around a center point, two nested orbs, and forms a protective circular enclosure. The nested orbs, as we have explained before, are Mars within Venus. It is the red planet's color that is the origin of the red color of the fruit. After all, Mars was the apple of the eye of Venus, as David Talbot explains. The apple of the eye archetype is mentioned several times in the Old Testament. The apple motif is memorialized in other myths. For example, in Greek myth, the Trojan hero Paris is asked to judge between three beauties, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite.
Zeus tells him to award the golden apple from the garden of Hesperides to the fairest of the three. In making his choice, the so-called judgment of Paris, he hands the apple to Aphrodite, just as Eve handed the fruit to Adam. The iconography is the same. The same archetype is used in another contest of the fairest of them all, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In these representations of the mythic symbolism, the hands are joined through the fruit. Sometimes the hands touch and sometimes they do not. But implied, if not explicit, is the clasping of hands. In other representations of Adam and Eve, the apple is no longer present and the express handshake replaces the apple. In some variations of the mythic scene of the twins with outstretched arms, the tree is replaced by God as the central columnar figure. In this pencil drawing by William Blake, God the Father has just created Eve and is giving her to Adam. The joining of the two will be the Sacred Handclasp, implied by God taking the two hands and drawing them together. This woodcut of God giving Eve to Adam uses the same archetypal image. Though the biblical record does not state it openly, Adam and Eve were married. According to Jewish legend, God himself performed the ceremony on the sixth day in the garden. The legends do not specify the exact presentation, but we know from early representations that the marriage was performed by dexiosis, the clasping of hands. In this drawing, Adam and Eve clasp hands as God blesses the union. This is the same pattern as the marriage of Moses and Zipporah, the Greco-Roman versions of the dexiosis between husband and wife, the marriage of the Virgin, and the European wedding. Notice in the drawing, the iconography of the original twins is preserved. Adam's right arm and Eve's left arm form enclosing crescents. Both hold trees representative of the axis mundi. Adam and Eve clasping hands is presented in the LDS iconography as well as in the representation of the married couple in the Garden of Eden. The hand clasp as a symbol of marriage, or, more specifically, a symbol of the union of male and female, originates from the twin archetype. Male and female twins extend their hands to each other and clasp them when they meet in the center.
The center itself is a conjunction of Mars and Venus, which represent the male and female powers of heaven. 17th century Dutch wedding booklets are very clear on this point. Their iconography repeatedly equates the handclasp of marriage with the heart, signifying the presence of the heavenly heart of hearts, Mars. Note the circular enclosure and the cloud-like crescents from which the hands extend. This booklet has the handshake under a heart or perhaps an apple and the tree of Eden. Some booklets portrayed the handshake associated with two hearts bound together. The female heart represents Venus as the heart of heaven. The male heart represents Mars as the heart of hearts. The scriptural reference to Matthew 19 within the wreath and above the handshake explains the meaning of the marital handshake in bound hearts. As Jesus Christ explained to the Pharisees, men and women were created together to become one flesh. Just as Mars and Venus, male and female, are conjoined into one, so husband and wife become one flesh through the binding of hearts and the joining of hands. As we've already seen, many representations of the heavenly handshake do not portray the twins themselves. The hands extend towards the center from a circle, as in this carving on the Salt Lake Temple. However, the twins are implied by the circle itself, formed by the circuit of the crescent during the daily cycle. In this case, the hands are both male. The clasping of hands does not signify becoming one flesh as in the sacred handclasp of husband and wife. Instead, as we have discussed previously, it represents amity, fellowship, and covenant. The archetype of the sacred handclasp takes another form in the Genesis account. When Abraham was nearing death, he had his servant swear to him that he would not allow his son to marry a daughter of the Canaanites. The servant did so by putting his hand under the patriarch's thigh. This ritual of oath-taking was repeated by Jacob, where he had his son Joseph swear to bury him outside of Egypt. The ritual is a form of swearing fidelity and oath-taking, like unto raising one's right hand or shaking hands. Like the handclasp, the touching of the thigh is a symbolic artifact of the mythic twins. The depiction of the death of Pentheus clearly follows the archetype. Pentheus, the figure in the center with outstretched arms, was king of Thebes. As such, he is an avatar of Mars. His arms are the plasma streams stretching outward from Venus. On each side of Pentheus stands a female with an arched back. Now, these are the two crescent figures, the twins. As they dismember the king, their arms form a secondary and smaller circular enclosure. In this particular version of the mythic scene, the left arm of Pentheus stretches beyond the female to the right and touches the thigh of a satyr with upraised arms. The satyr also is arched in the shape of a crescent. Touching the thigh is a mythic interpretation of the intersection of plasma streamer and crescent. Another Greek red figure bull shows Bacchus playing a pipe and being touched on the thigh just below his genitals. The twins' archetype is not only right and left, but is also above and below. When the crescents were positioned opposite each other at their highest and lowest points, they represented one above the other, as in this illustration of Nut and Geb from the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
For example, in Egypt, we see the aspects above and below in the symbolic pairing of the figures Nut and Geb.
In the center of the illustration stands the god Shu. His head is the planet Mars within the enclosure, and his outstretched arms are the plasma streamers. His torso is the axis mundi. The arms are also in the shape of a Ka, or squared outstretched arms, a representation of the crescent.
Indeed, every primary interpretation of the revolving crescent was predictably linked to the dualities of above and below, or left and right. It was not just as a pair of outstretched arms that we see the twin roles of the crescent, upright in the phase of growing bright and inverted in the phase of growing dim.
Shu's arms touching the body of the goddess Nu makes a secondary circular enclosure. Shu's left hand touches the breasts of Nu, and his right hand touches the thighs of the goddess, known as the two thighs of Nut.
Elsewhere in imitation of Ra, the deceased king aspires to shine between the two thighs of Nut.
Though not graphically explicit, the hand is inserted in between the two thighs. In actuality, the two thighs were the two opposing crescents themselves, which divided the enclosure into two halves and formed the twin goddesses themselves. This version of Nut and Geb shows Geb inserting his foot between Nut's thighs. The facsimile makes it clear that the foot is between the thighs. Again, the plasma streamers represented limbs, either arms or legs. In summary, it is the archetype of the twins and central figure that is the origin of both the handshake, and the touching the thigh as symbolic as a surety of an oath.